Tom Bower has built his reputation on documentation and timing. He does not respond to rumor in real time. Let's talk about what really happened when one of Britain's most feared biographers finally broke his silence. For months, Tom Bower watched. He observed, he made mental notes while the rest of the world screamed for answers. This wasn't hesitation. This was calculation. Silence in this framework is not absence, it is data. When controversies erupted across the royal landscape, journalists scrambled for quotes, media outlets demanded reactions. The public wanted someone to confirm what they suspected. Tom Bower gave them nothing. Not a word, not a hint, not even a carefully worded no comment. He simply disappeared from the conversation entirely, and that absence became louder than any statement he could have made. By staying quiet, he allowed the environment to reveal its own priorities. What many people don't know is what was unfolding behind that silence. Bower wasn't ignoring the stories circulating about Meghan Markle and her connection to various royal crises. He was studying something far more revealing than the allegations themselves. He was watching who reacted, who stayed silent, who issued denials, and most importantly, who changed their behavior without explanation. This approach separates Bower from every other royal commentator. While others chased headlines, he chased patterns. While they analyzed individual incidents, he mapped institutional responses. The method is surgical, clinical, almost disturbing in its patience. During this period, several royal crises overlapped in ways that seemed almost choreographed. Legal pressure mounted on Prince Andrew. Public fallout intensified from the Sussex's media projects. The palace maintained institutional silence on multiple fronts simultaneously. These events weren't connected by the same trigger, but they unfolded within a compressed timeline that made observers uncomfortable. For Bower, that compression mattered deeply. According to people familiar with his approach, Bower wasn't interested in whether specific allegations were true or false. Truth, in his methodology, is less important than reaction. He wanted to understand which stories provoked immediate correction from the palace, which were completely ignored, and which prompted visible institutional movement without any public explanation attached. On this particular occasion, the palace's behavior created a hierarchy of concern that fascinated him. Some controversies received swift, decisive responses. Others lingered in the public consciousness for months without a single official word. That disparity revealed institutional priorities more clearly than any press statement ever could. Meghan Markle appeared as a recurring figure across these overlapping controversies. Bower's analysis didn't frame her as the source of problems. Instead, he positioned her as a constant, someone present at moments where powerful institutions quietly recalibrated their behavior. Not accused of wrongdoing directly, but consistently positioned near points of tension that made palace advisors nervous. This distinction was deliberate and devastatingly effective. Bower understands something most commentators miss. Accusations invite defense. Context invites reflection. By refusing to accuse, he forced audiences to reflect on institutional behavior patterns instead of debating guilt or innocence. The conversation shifted from "did she do it" to "why did they respond that way?" Inside Buckingham Palace, silence was never accidental. Palace advisors undergo years of training to respond proportionally to threats. Issues threatening constitutional stability receive immediate attention and carefully crafted responses. Issues that remain reputational or speculative are often left completely untouched, allowed to fade through lack of oxygen rather than confrontation. Over time, these calculated decisions create a visible pattern for those trained to recognize it. Bower watched that pattern form with the focus of a predator. He also observed how public interpretation evolved in real time. Early speculation about Meghan was dismissed as tabloid excess, predictable racism, or jealousy toward a modern woman entering an ancient institution. But repetition changed perception. When similar questions resurfaced month after month without correction or clarification, silence began to feel intentional rather than incidental. Bower didn't validate those questions directly. He simply observed how institutions handled them and what that handling revealed about their internal calculations. This is exactly why his silence lasted as long as it did. According to colleagues who've worked alongside him, Bauer waited until enough behavior had accumulated to speak without needing to allege anything specific. His goal was never to introduce new claims or sensational accusations. Instead, he wanted to explain why certain claims persisted in public consciousness despite lacking concrete proof. The answer, in his carefully constructed view, lay not in what was said publicly, but in how institutional power responded privately. Sources close to the situation quietly revealed that Bauer's team tracked palace movements with obsessive detail during this period, which advisors were promoted or sidelined, which communication strategies shifted without announcement, which access points closed to the Sussexes without formal explanation. These weren't dramatic moments, they were subtle institutional adjustments that only become visible when mapped over months. By the time Bauer chose to comment publicly, the environment had shifted dramatically. Public trust in royal narratives was already strained to breaking point. The Sussexes' relationship with British media institutions had deteriorated beyond repair. Palace non-responses were being read less generously by audiences who'd grown suspicious of official silence. In that context, even measured commentary carried enormous weight. When Bauer finally broke silence, he did not name crimes. He did not publish new allegations. He spoke about systems, about access, about how institutions decide when to intervene and when to wait. When Tom Bauer finally spoke, he did so in a way that caught everyone off guard. There was no dramatic press conference staged for maximum media impact, no explosive reveal designed to dominate news cycles, no new allegation introduced into an already saturated public record. Instead, Bauer addressed something more unsettling than any single scandal could be. He explained the atmosphere that had formed around multiple royal controversies and why certain claims refused to disappear, no matter how many times they were dismissed. His focus wasn't on proving specific allegations true or false, it was on explaining why institutions behaved the way they consistently did when faced with recurring disruption. At that point in time, the distinction Bauer drew became crucial to understanding everything that followed. He acknowledged openly that many claims circulating online were unproven, and in some cases genuinely irresponsible, but he argued forcefully that dismissing them outright missed the fundamental point entirely. What mattered wasn't whether every individual claim held water under scrutiny. What mattered was why the palace reacted selectively, shutting down some narratives immediately, while allowing others to linger indefinitely in public consciousness. Institutional reaction is never random, Bauer explained in his characteristically measured tone. He detailed how royal systems are fundamentally designed to assess risk rather than fairness. When a story threatens constitutional stability, it receives immediate attention and carefully coordinated response. When it threatens reputation but lacks legal force, it's often strategically ignored. Over extended periods, this creates a visible pattern to anyone watching closely enough. Silence becomes a signal, even when it's not consciously intended as one. This is where Meghan Markle entered Bauer's public discussion again, but not in the way most expected. He didn't accuse her of orchestrating scandals behind the scenes. He didn't suggest criminality or deliberate manipulation of events. What he noted with clinical precision was recurrence, her presence at specific moments where the palace demonstrably recalibrated its public posture. Her proximity to situations that prompted internal caution without external explanation. From Bauer's analytical perspective, this recurrence altered how institutions behaved regardless of anyone's intent or personal character. That distinction mattered enormously in how his commentary was received and interpreted. Institutions do not need wrongdoing to change strategy. They respond to pressure, exposure, and unpredictability. Bauer emphasized this point repeatedly in various interviews. When a figure becomes a focal point for repeated controversy, even indirectly, institutional systems begin to manage around that figure, rather than confront the controversy itself head-on. It's a defensive adaptation, not a moral judgment. Inside Buckingham Palace, this logic is well established among senior advisors. Bauer described in detailed terms how palace advisors assess not just individual events, but long-term trajectories. A single incident can be explained away with context and appropriate messaging. Repeated turbulence across months or years cannot be managed the same way. When turbulence becomes consistently associated with a specific person or partnership, the institutional response inevitably shifts from engagement to distance. That shift doesn't require assigning blame to anyone. It simply requires pattern recognition and risk management. Behind closed doors, the tone was far more serious than public statements suggested. Advisors who'd initially defended the Sussexes' integration into modern royal life began quietly advocating for separation strategies. Not punishment, not exile, just carefully managed distance that protected institutional stability. Bauer also addressed a common misconception that silence equals weakness or confusion. In his detailed analysis, silence is often the strongest response available to powerful institutions. It denies oxygen to controversies. It avoids creating legal exposure through official statements. It allows time to reduce relevance and public attention naturally. The palace, he suggested with considerable evidence, had used silence not to protect specific individuals, but to protect itself from escalation that could spiral beyond control. This explanation reframed several high-profile moments that had confused public observers for months. Many had interpreted palace non-responses as avoidance, quiet endorsement, or institutional incompetence. Bauer argued they were none of these things. They were containment, a calculated decision not to enter narratives that couldn't be controlled once formally engaged. When a figure becomes a focal point for repeated controversy, even indirectly, systems begin to manage around that figure rather than confront the controversy itself. For Prince Harry, this framing proved particularly destabilizing to his worldview. Bauer noted that Harry appeared to interpret institutional silence emotionally rather than strategically. He assumed that if something truly mattered to the palace, it would be addressed openly and directly. That assumption fundamentally doesn't hold inside systems built to outlast individuals and survive centuries. In those ancient systems, silence often signals that engagement would create more long-term damage than strategic restraint. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal that Harry struggled deeply with this reality. He wanted confrontation, clarity, public accountability. The institution offered him none of these things, not out of cruelty, but out of institutional self-preservation instinct, honed over generations. Bauer's comments didn't settle public debate about the Sussexes or Meghan specifically. What they accomplished was far more significant. They shifted the entire conversation's framework. Instead of endless arguments over the truth of specific claims, attention moved to institutional behavior itself. Why the palace chose distance over engagement. Why advisors recalibrated access without explanation. Why certain communication lines cooled noticeably without any official announcement. These questions do not require proof to persist, they require observation. Tom Bauer's decision to speak didn't trigger immediate dramatic consequences. There were no emergency palace statements rushed out to counter his analysis, no legal responses threatened, no formal rebuttals issued through official channels. On the surface, absolutely nothing changed in the royal landscape. That absence of reaction was entirely deliberate, and it followed a familiar institutional logic that Bauer himself had predicted. Inside Buckingham Palace, Bauer's public comments were carefully categorized. They weren't treated as an event requiring response. They were processed as commentary, and commentary, even when profoundly uncomfortable, doesn't require institutional response, unless it introduces verifiable new facts or creates legal exposure. Bauer had done neither of these things strategically. He had explained existing behavior, rather than alleged new wrongdoing. From the palace's institutional perspective, this distinction made silence the tactically correct response. Engaging with his analysis would have elevated his framing into mainstream discussion. Ignoring it allowed the commentary to circulate briefly among royal watchers before folding into the endless background noise. The institution has long understood through bitter experience that authors and commentators gain power primarily through reaction. Without one, their words circulate in limited circles and then fade from immediate relevance. This is precisely why outwardly nothing happened after Bauer spoke. Internally, however, his remarks produced a subtle but significant effect that insiders noticed immediately. According to palace observers with Meghan Markle specifically, this new visibility mattered enormously, in practical terms. Bauer's framing still didn't accuse her of causing scandals or orchestrating negative press campaigns. What it suggested with devastating clarity was that her proximity to repeated institutional stress points had fundamentally altered how the palace behaved around her and made decisions about the Sussexes generally. That implication is exceptionally difficult to counter effectively because it doesn't hinge on intent, character, or specific actions. It hinges entirely on observable patterns, and patterns once perceived by large audiences become remarkably resistant to rebuttal or correction. For Prince Harry, the impact cut even more personally and deeply. Bauer's carefully structured comments undermined a core assumption Harry had relied upon for years in his relationship with palace institutions: the belief that silence meant absence of concern, or that issues were being ignored rather than actively managed. Only later did the true impact become apparent to those close to Harry's thinking. Bauer explained with uncomfortable precision that institutional silence often means exactly the opposite of what Harry assumed. It frequently signals that concern has been thoroughly assessed at senior levels, and engagement has been consciously rejected as counterproductive to institutional interests. That distinction fundamentally reframed Harry's understanding of previous non-responses he'd interpreted as neglect or disrespect. Sources close to the situation quietly revealed that this realization reinforced a growing painful awareness. Institutions like the monarchy don't communicate reassurance or emotional support. They communicate exclusively through carefully calibrated behavior. Distance, reduced access, and procedural restraint are themselves signals, even when no words accompany the changes. This recognition didn't produce any dramatic public reaction from Harry, but it noticeably altered his posture in subsequent public appearances and private communications. The hope for institutional reconciliation seemed to drain visibly from his public statements. Hollywood and media institutions absorbed Bauer's analysis from a completely different angle. Producers, studio executives, and major commentators didn't treat his remarks as shocking revelations. They processed them as confirmation of something already sensed, but not previously articulated so clearly. That royal silence wasn't indecision or confusion. It was deliberate strategy, and strategies tend to persist once formally adopted by ancient institutions. This recognition contributed to industry recalibration around Sussex-related projects, not cancellations or public denunciations that would create their own controversies, just increased caution in green-lighting projects, more careful legal review of claims, heightened sensitivity to potential palace responses. When institutional distance becomes publicly visible and named, other powerful institutions take careful note. They don't rush to contradict it or declare independence. They wait strategically to see if it hardens into permanent precedent worth respecting. Bauer's words changed the frame without changing the facts. Before his intervention, speculation about Meghan and palace tensions was dismissed as rumor, tabloid excess, or prejudice. After his carefully constructed analysis, it was contextualized as reasonable reaction to observable institutional behavior patterns. That shift doesn't require universal agreement. He didn't validate any specific accusation floating through social media and tabloid coverage. What he accomplished was more significant. He explained systematically why the institutional system behaved as it observably did, and why that behavior should never be misread as randomness or incompetence. The palace maintained its characteristic distance from the Sussexes. That distance now appeared intentional and strategic, rather than evasive or The conversation didn't end simply because Tom Bauer spoke his analysis into public record. What happened instead was more subtle and potentially more consequential for everyone involved. The conversation fundamentally changed shape. structure, and focus in ways that couldn't easily be reversed. Instead of asking what was specifically true about various allegations, audiences began asking an entirely different question. Why did institutions respond the particular way they
demonstrably did?
What did those response patterns reveal about internal calculations and long-term strategy? That question proved considerably harder to dismiss. It demanded interpretation of observable behavior across extended time frames. Many are now questioning how palace decision-making actually functions in crisis moments. The explanations offered through official channels had consistently raised more questions than they answered over the preceding months. Even now, there remains no official clarity on why certain approaches were chosen while others were conspicuously avoided. As this chapter of the royal story reached its conclusion, the outcome became increasingly clear to everyone watching closely. Tom Bower had not exposed hidden secrets or produced smoking gun evidence of wrongdoing. What he'd accomplished was potentially more disruptive. The exposed institutional process itself, its systems built on centuries-old process that could be just as disruptive. Royal procedures continued exactly as before. Advisors maintained their position. Official statements followed established patterns. But Bower fundamentally changed how institutional silence was understood and interpreted. Once silence is widely seen as calculated strategy rather than neutral accents, it permanently loses its protective neutrality. Audiences begin reading meaning into every non-response, finding patterns in what isn't said as much as what is formally stated. And when that neutrality disappears from public perception, institutional distance risks becoming permanent. Audiences begin reading meaning into every non-response, finding patterns in what isn't meaningless. The palace demonstrated no outward concern about this shift in public interpretation. Official channels maintained absolute consistency in their approach. Silence remained the default response to commentary and analysis, exactly as institutional tradition demanded. That distance now looked unmistakably intentional, rather than evasive or uncertain, to observers. Meghan and Harry continued their separate lives, without issuing public responses to Bower's analysis. That absence of rebuttal now carried distinctly different meaning than it would have carried months earlier. Some interpreted it as dignified restraint, others read it as implicit confirmation that the patterns Bower described were accurate. The ambiguity itself became part of the narrative's power. Multiple reports point toward the same general conclusion among royal analysts and historians. Bower's intervention marked a turning point, not in what was known, but in how institutional behavior would be interpreted going forward. The framework he provided would shape coverage and public understanding for years to come. For the palace, this created a complex strategic challenge without clear solution. Responding directly to Bower's framework would elevate it further and grant it institutional legitimacy it didn't currently possess. Ignoring it allowed the interpretation to settle into public consciousness as accepted wisdom. Historically, the monarchy has consistently chosen the latter approach when faced with this particular dilemma. Silence absorbs commentary and criticism, without legitimizing it, through engagement. Time erodes urgency. New controversies replace old ones in the relentless news cycle. But this situation carried unique characteristics that made historical precedent less reliable as a guide. Bauer hadn't made allegations that could fade with time. He'd provided an interpretive framework that made all future palace behavior legible as strategic choice. That framework became self-reinforcing. Every subsequent silence would be read through it. Every calculated non-response would confirm the pattern he'd described. These stories provide insight into how modern media analysis shapes institutional reputation in ways previous generations never encountered. The speed of information distribution, the permanence of digital archives, and the sophistication of audience interpretation have fundamentally altered the game. What followed remains largely unexplored in mainstream coverage, but deeply significant for understanding current royal dynamics. The palace adapted by becoming even more selective about which issues received formal response. The threshold for engagement rose noticeably. More controversies were allowed to circulate without official comment. This wasn't retreat or weakness, it was doubling down on the strategy Bauer had exposed. The institutional calculation became transparent to careful observers. If silence was now understood as strategy anyway, there was no benefit to breaking it more frequently. Better to reserve formal responses for genuinely existential threats and allow everything else to circulate without institutional oxygen. For Meghan and Harry, this evolution created increasingly difficult terrain to navigate. Their attempts to control narrative through media projects and interviews encountered an institution that had become even more committed to strategic non-engagement. The asymmetry became stark. They spoke frequently and publicly. The palace maintained near total silence. In previous eras, that silence might have been interpreted as the palace losing the narrative battle. In the post-Bauer framework, silence itself communicated institutional confidence and long-term strategic thinking. The full implications may only now be emerging as this approach becomes normalized across royal crisis management. What Bauer ultimately accomplished was creating a new lens through which royal behavior would be interpreted indefinitely. He didn't expose what the palace was hiding. He exposed how the palace operates when it chooses strategic distance over engagement. That distinction matters profoundly because it shifts focus from specific allegations to institutional character. It transforms every future controversy into a case study of how power manages persistent disruption. And in that transformation, Bauer ensured his analysis would remain relevant far longer than any individual scandal or controversy. The story didn't, it simply entered a new phase, where silence carried unmistakable meaning, and that meaning would shape royal dynamics for years to come.